Just how much can a fighting career be affected by the friends you keep? Well, in the case of the elite middleweight contender Khamzat Chimaev, as it turns out, quite a lot. From his humble roots, this Chechen powerhouse climbed his way to superstar status, but after a stunning run to kick off his UFC career, Chimaev has found himself tied to a very controversial and dangerous figure within the fight game. This is the story of how Chimaev found himself in league with a Chechen warlord. When Chimaev first landed in the UFC, he represented something truly unique and new within the sport. A hungry and extremely driven fighter who was willing to compete far more than any of his peers.
Yeah, I want to fight next week. Doesn't matter when. Today, tomorrow. One more fight. I'm so hungry.
In other words, he was a promotional dream. But after fighting 3 times in his first 3 months as a UFC fighter, Khamzat's career has been extremely complicated ever since, with just 5 appearances in the last 5 years. And it's not just his health issues and weight management that have been worrying. No, Boris has found himself in the company of one of the most controversial figures connected to the sport, period. But before we get into that, let's talk about the road that led Chimaev to where he is now. Born in Chechnya, this future star spent his early years in his home country, touching down on wrestling mats for the first time at the age of just 5 years old, before moving to Sweden with his mother at the age of 18. It was there that he carved out his first moments of legit wrestling success, going all the way to the gold medal level in the Swedish National Wrestling Championships at 2 different weight classes. Being the greatest wrestler in Sweden was quite the feat, but it was clear to Khamzat that he was a big fish in a small pond. However, at the age of 23, upon watching Conor McGregor's legendary destruction of the great Jose Aldo in just 13 seconds, Chimaev realized that he needed to make a change. Mixed martial arts became his new passion, and after going a perfect 3-0 at the amateur level, Boris turned pro just after his 24th birthday, scoring 6 finishes in 6 fights over the course of 16 months to announce himself to the world. You guys all know the story from there. Dana White and his team were clearly interested in Khamzat, and so, when a short notice opportunity came up for him, he made his UFC debut and let the world know exactly who he was. The problems began to form just as his momentum was starting to build. For any athlete who comes from a region with a very powerful and far-reaching leader, they're going to find themselves in a tricky situation before too long. Because, as a representative of the Chechen nation, you don't disrespect a figure like Kadyrov without suffering some form of consequences. But who exactly is Ramzan Kadyrov? He is the leader of the Chechen Republic, famous for his totally ruthless approach to anyone he perceives to be a threat. Reports of kidnapping, torture, and even assassinations are common when Kadyrov is involved. In fact, his love of death threats is only the tip of the iceberg.
У нас таких людей нету. Нету у нас геев. Если есть, заберите в Канаду. Хвала Аллаху.
Once, during a live stream that he filmed with Chimaev was standing right beside him, Kadyrov made a very clear threat against a teenage boy who had left a critical comment on his video, threatening his whole family while the UFC middleweight stood to his side.
Сейчас завещание делать, если я умру, помогите моей семье там. Я очень много шайтанов там уничтожал, и тебя тоже уничтожил.
This led to the boy's father recording a very panicked apology video for his own lack of parenting skills, which was later broadcast on Chechnya's national TV channel. But if you know anything about Kadyrov's crimes against humanity, you'll know that the apology was basically the only way for this father to fight for his son's life. People who stand up to Kadyrov tend to have a habit of going missing, and ever since he rose to power as president nearly 2 decades ago, he has been constantly associated with the nastiest of crimes, making him one of the most notorious world leaders currently active. He took power in the Chechen nation at the age of 30, and in the time since, he has slowly leaned into the world of mixed martial arts, hosting many famous and successful fighters. But there are many who believe that it is obvious that Chimaev is not connected with Kadyrov by choice. and that for him, to reject someone of such power and authority could put him and his loved ones in danger. So what is the history between these two? Chimaev's link to the upper tiers of the Chechen government was first reported on when he received the gift of a Mercedes-Benz from the nation's leader, Kadyrov. During this period in his career, Khamzat was still quite young and wild, not yet finding his more calm and relaxed side, which arrived when he became a father. Supposedly, he actually crashed that Mercedes not long after receiving it, completely destroying the vehicle in the process. But from there, we began to see more and more instances of Chimaev and Kadyrov associating closely, as the Chechen warlord took the UFC fighter under his wing and attempted to mold him into a poster boy for Chenya's success on a global level. And whether Khamzat was happy about this or simply putting up with it because he had no choice, here's where you'll begin to see Kadyrov's influence on the career of his Chechen wolf come to the fore. Back when Chimaev was a red-hot introduction to the UFC, his difficulty with making the welterweight limit was a constant concern, and when a particularly bad case of COVID left him sidelined when his stock was at its highest, a worrying rumor began to circulate that Chimaev was considering retirement from the sport. In other words, his body was giving out on him, and Kadyrov was coming dangerously close to losing a prized asset. No one knows exactly what happened next, but in the words of the great Don Corleone, it seemed like Kadyrov made Chimaev an offer he couldn't refuse, and all of a sudden, Borz was reconsidering his decision. What we got next was an inconsistent performance schedule from Khamzat, and it does seem as though the health issues that have constantly plagued him have not fully been dealt with. Remember when he missed weight by 7.5 pounds prior to UFC 279? Or the illness that forced him out of his originally scheduled clash with Robert Whittaker? Well, obviously he eventually did manage to fight and beat Whittaker, securing himself the #1 contender spot in the division. But there's another issue. Chimaev has basically admitted that he has received a travel ban that prohibits him from entering the United States, forcing him to wait for each UFC return to the UAE before he signs the fight. And for a guy who is known to be a little unreliable when it comes to pulling out of bouts due to health concerns, this is not ideal. It's widely accepted that Chimaev's ties to Kadyrov are the reason for his ban, although it does seem as though things might be looking a little bit more positive for his chances now that Donald Trump is in office, and tends to have Dana White's best interests in mind. For many people, the fighting career of Khamzat has been thrilling, interesting, and impressive, but ultimately disappointing so far. Some of that is bad luck. Some of it clearly comes down to physical issues he possesses, but the company a man keeps can have a major impact on his opportunities. Even a bona fide fighting legend like Fedor Emelianenko couldn't protect himself from Kadyrov's wrath when he made criticism of the warlord in public, only for his teenage daughter to get attacked in Moscow just a few days after. Emelianenko, the former Pride champion and the current head of Russia's Mixed Martial Arts Union, took shots at Kadyrov for allowing a fight show to take place featuring young children competing. 3 of Ranzam's own preteen sons took part in this show and won their fights. Can you imagine what the consequences would be for actually beating one of his offspring? Even Chimaev, one of the greatest fighters at his weight on the planet, flops to the ground helplessly to let the Chechen warlord win. Not out of politeness, but out of pure fear. But what do you think of Khamzat's stunted UFC career so far? And do you think that Kadyrov's influence is truly holding him back? What do you think the future holds for Chimaev within the middleweight division? Do let us know your thoughts in the comments section below, before leaving a like plus subscribing so you don't miss any of our deep dive videos.